My name is Andrew Callahan, and you're watching Channel 5 News. This video features both interviews conducted in northern Israel and southern Lebanon at the exact same time. On the Israeli front, we have our two-time correspondent Agat Schwartz, who interviews a regional IDF commander and local residents who refuse to leave the conflict zone despite bold government warnings. And in Lebanon, we have our recently displaced guest correspondent, Wael, who interviews civilians affected by Israeli airstrikes.
Israel is the only reason to blame.
Well, obviously it's the Shia Muslims to blame because they initiated the fucking war.
And spends time in a homeless encampment where people have gathered to seek shelter and await government aid. But that's not all. We also sent a camera crew to interview a senior Hezbollah official who speaks on record for the first time ever.
Hezbollah did a preemptive move to defend Gaza and Lebanon. It struck and opened fire on Israel to keep it busy, weaken it, and foil its plan.
But before we get into it, let's back up a bit. Our coverage begins in the parking lot of a shopping center in northern Israel.
לחיות ככה זה מאוד קשה לאנשים, לילדים, למשפחות, ללימודים. כל שנייה בום, כל שנייה רעש, כל שנייה זעקות.
Hezbollah upping its drone attacks into northern Israel.
זה לא חיים. מגיע לנו לחיות בשקט. אבל נחיה פה, נהיה פה, נשאר פה. וכל מה שצריך לעשות, נעשה פה בשביל להישאר פה. מאמין בצה"ל, צבא ישראלית, נקודה.
All right, so we just arrived at Kiryat Shmona, an evacuated city very close to the border with Lebanon. Right after the city, some places have been declared as war zones, so nobody can get in besides the military. This city has been bombarded heavily since the beginning of the war. It has been evacuated, but some people still refuse to leave, so we're here to ask them what's up. למה החלטת להישאר בצפון?
היינו במלחמת לבנון השנייה, אז גם נעבור את זה איכשהו, בעצב רב.
קוראים לי חנה כהן ושלומי טוב מאוד. אני מפה, מקריית שמונה, אני לא עזבתי. אני פה בארץ עוד מלפני מלחמת השחרור, ושום מקום בארץ בעצם לא בטוח. אני לא פוחדת מאף אחד.
איך היית רוצה שזה ימשיך מכאן?
להסיר את האיום של חיזבאללה מהצפון.
Israel launched a ground campaign inside southern Lebanon to push Hezbollah fighters back.
אני לא חושבת שצריך להפסיק את הלחימה. אנחנו מצד אחד שמחים שמטפלים לבנון.
אני מקווה מאוד שהשקט יחזור. צה"ל חייב לגרום פה לאיזושהי רצועת ביטחון שתשמור עלינו, כי היישובים שגרים על ההר, שמקבלים את הנ"טים ישירות ומטולה לקטסטרופה, זה ברור לגמרי.
Hezbollah later claimed responsibility for a drone attack on Tuesday.
ובשנה האחרונה זה לא הכי נוח.
אידיאולוגיה של ארגונים כאלה כמו חיזבאללה, כמו חמאס, זה להקים ישות אסלאמית. כלומר, מדינה שיעית, אסלאמית, קיצונית, עם משטר דתי קיצוני.
חיזבאללה זה ארגון טרור, אותו צריך להשמיד, אין ברירה, אין פה מנוס.
מה אתה חושב בעצם על חיזבאללה?
שהם פחדנים, הם חושבים שהם יותר חזקים, אבל הם לא. אבל לדעתי ננצח בסוף, כאילו אין צה"ל הצבא הכי חזק בעולם, אז זהו, כאילו אנחנו נכסח אותם.
If they have a war with Hezbollah, why did they kill my mother and sister? Why did they hit all our building?
Airstrikes have hit the southern suburbs of Beirut in the past few hours.
Here's supposed to be my room. Here is one of my sports shirts, and this is my pillow.
In southern Beirut, there was a strike next to the biggest government hospital in the country, in which 4 people were killed, including a child.
Civilian peoples, one of them is an insurance company, one of them is a bus driver. Why? Because they live in this building, they are killed. For what reason?
We've been told by the Israelis that they're now going after Hezbollah's financial infrastructure.
Why do you think Israel would strike this building?
They want to hit this place, they hit this place. They know that nobody will ask them, why did you did this?
هو الإسرائيلي بس مهم يعمل دمار. هو بيقصف مدني وبيقول إنه نحن اختلنا حدا ونحن ضربنا مصنع صواريخ. هون في مصنع صواريخ، بيوت عشوائية، هون ما في مصنع صواريخ. ما في شيء هون.
As usual, most of the victims were civilians, including women and children.
As long as Hezbollah chooses the path of war, that's exactly what we're doing.
To get a more academic perspective on the conflict, we decided to sit down with a familiar face, Dr. James Gelvin.
My name is James Gelvin. I'm a professor of Middle Eastern history at UCLA.
As some of you may recall, Professor Gelvin once walked us through the Israel-Hamas conflict in the wake of the October 7th attacks. So I figured he was the guy to speak about Hezbollah. What is Hezbollah?
Hezbollah is a Shi'i organization that represents the Shi'i community of Lebanon.
It started out as a social service organization, actually an ambulance corps.
Hezbollah supporters say the group provides them with key social and economic support.
And then moved on to other things. Now it's got a political role. There are 15 members, I believe, of Hezbollah in parliament. It's not a majority faction, but it works with other factions as well, and it's got a militia.
As he explains, Hezbollah didn't begin as a posse of lobbyists or politicians, but in 1982 as a civilian militia during the Lebanese Civil War. After the Civil War ended in 1990, every other militia, and there were many, were disarmed and disbanded after a ceasefire agreement, except for Hezbollah, who were tasked with driving the Israeli army out of the country.
And Hezbollah is the only militia coming out of the Civil War that was allowed to maintain its weaponry. All the other ones were disarmed, and now all the warlords from the Civil War are basically politicians running their operations through the political process.
In rebuilding the country after the Civil War, Lebanon became a parliamentary republic, wherein their government is composed of 16 different political parties who mostly can't agree on anything, leading to total stagnation and economic depression.
In Lebanon, you don't have a government. You have a complete economic meltdown that started in 2020 or so, 2019 actually. You've had a series of rolling protests that have begun starting in 2019 as well. But the economic situation in Lebanon is devastating. You have close to 80% of your population now living in poverty. You have mass emigration from Lebanon.
And to make matters worse, Israeli bombardment of the country's commercial center has led to Lebanon's largest refugee crisis since the Civil War ended in 1990.
There have been about 3,500 casualties, and there's been about 1.5 million internally displaced people who had to leave their homes because they were under bombardment. There have been about 450,000 people who went over the border seeking sanctuary in Syria, of all places. Now, most of those were Syrian refugees to begin with, but the very fact that they decided that Syria was safer than Lebanon demonstrates something, I think. I mean, they're bombing cities. They're bombing Beirut.
One of the Lebanese citizens displaced by Israeli bombardment is our guest correspondent, who wanted to give Channel 5 viewers a boots-on-the-ground perspective of the situation unfolding in Dahia, a Shia-majority suburb of Beirut regarded as being the center of Hezbollah activity in the region. So much like in Gaza, Israel has been airstriking whole apartment blocks, office buildings, and hospitals in the area, claiming to be targeting Hezbollah militants. And unfortunately, many civilians have been caught in the crossfire.
The United Nations has warned about Lebanon becoming another Gaza.
I mean, look, basically the number of civilians that are being killed, we're talking about casualty figures of about 70% of the deaths are civilian deaths. We're talking about apartment blocks being blown up. We're talking about infrastructure being destroyed. We're talking about women and children being killed.
Here's the scene on the ground.
Hello, my name is Wael, reporting for Channel 5 in Lebanon. I live in Beirut, in Dahia, which means suburbs. I had to move away from my house when Israel started bombing Dahia. A fifth of the population is displaced, like me right now. When the Israeli army bombs Dahia, sometimes they would issue no warnings at all prior to their strikes. But sometimes they would do via Twitter, and not everyone have Twitter in Lebanon. I take my family as an example, a family of 5, and I'm the only one who has Twitter. So few people would know about these evacuations. And even when people know, sometimes the Israeli army would start striking 10 minutes after the warnings, which is not enough time for people to get out of their houses and get to safe places at all. Some people lost everything in this war, and we tried to speak to some of them.
We were sitting in the living room about 4 p.m. We heard a big sound of explosion here, and we saw a big dust coming from down. My mom came out from her room. I went to the kitchen and I brought for her a bottle of water. She didn't drink because she was so scared. I heard the same sound another time. I told them, run, the building is being bombed. My mom ran out of the house. I guess she reached the second floor. This is the max. Julia was trying to follow her. I went to my room to bring a t-shirt to wear it and run behind them. Then I felt the building was going down and going to the right. After the building was completely on the floor, I started shouting by their names to know where they are. My mother was the first one who was took from the building alive. but she was having bleeding on her abdominal, and the operation after 20 to 30 minutes she passed away. Julia, they find her about 12 midnight. Yes, she was dead because of lack of oxygen.
How do you feel, Ashraf, going back here to this site where your family members were killed?
Maybe it's the hardest question. Maybe I lost feelings. I lost how to feel from now on.
What do you think about the assessment of Hezbollah as a terror organization?
I think it commits acts of terrorism. It certainly targets civilian populations, which is a very definite definition of terrorism. They were behind the explosion in the Marine barracks in Beirut in 1983 that killed the largest number of Americans to die out of battle, ever, Marines in particular. They murdered the head of the American University in Beirut, Malcolm Kerr. They probably murdered the Prime Minister of Lebanon, with the idea being that the Syrians didn't particularly like him, and so they didn't either.
And the attack on a Jewish community center in Buenos Aires, when it became the first designated terror group to use suicide bombings.
What the Europeans have done is they differentiated between the political wing of Hezbollah and the military wing of Hezbollah. They've had to do that because, basically, if you can have Hezbollah in the government of Lebanon and you can consider the Hezbollah to be a terrorist organization, you can't talk to the government of Lebanon. Europeans have figured out a way around that. Now they consider Hezbollah to be a terrorist organization again.
You think Israel is guilty of war crimes?
I think Israel is responsible for needless civilian deaths, too many of them, 43,000, 44,000 Palestinian deaths in Gaza, which is a huge number. It's larger than any other group that the Israelis have fought against. So I think that the Israelis have done either war crimes or the equivalent of war crimes.
I'll provide a direct example. Just a few days before our team began their coverage in Lebanon, there was an airstrike on a prominent university hospital that killed 4.
It came just hours after Israel released a video claiming a Hezbollah bunker is underneath another major hospital.
Israeli military officials said that beneath the Al-Sahel hospital was a large underground bunker used by Hezbollah to store large quantities of weapons and cash.
There are hundreds of millions of dollars in cash and gold. However, we will not strike the hospital itself.
Instead of striking the hospital itself, they struck the buildings surrounding a different hospital, killing 18 and wounding hundreds.
The man in the red baseball cap is looking for his son.
Here's an interview with the best friend of one of the youngest victims. Watch carefully as his psychology shifts throughout the interview.
أنا من سكان المنطقة من هون وخسرنا كتير عالم بنحبها من هون نحنا. خسرت رفيقي جواد. خسرت حدا كتير عزيز على قلبي هو رفيقي وقضيت معه أيام حلوة كنا ناكل ونشرب سوا ونظهر نكزر سوا ونلعب وهيك. يعني كنا هيك قاعدين فجأة عم نلعب ونسمع صوت ضربة بنطلع كلنا بقولوا إنه هون حد المستشفى. يعني أنا دخل شلت التليفون دقيت له هو أول واحد ما كان يرد علي. ضلوا وقت تحت الردم 3 الصبح يطلعوه من تحت الردم واجانا الخبر انه هو استشهد.
A child among the dead.
تعرفوا شو اسمه قلت لي جواد؟
جواد علي المقداد. بقول له انه كلنا حنلحقه. هنيئا له وكلنا حنلحقه ونحن بهيدا الطريق كلنا فدا الحسين وكلنا هادي يا ابا هادي.
Who was Hassan Nasrallah?
He was the leader of Hezbollah. He was somebody who actually rebuilt Hezbollah after his predecessors were assassinated. Basically, the Israelis just recently assassinated him through an airstrike.
Palestinian militant group Hamas said Nasrallah's killing would only strengthen its resistance.
نحن قبلانين باللي عم بيصير. ونحن بدنا نموت. بدنا نستشهد.
كرمال شو؟
كرمال أهل البيت وكرمال الحسين وكرمال كل حدا استشهد عنا بالحزب. ونحن بدنا نكفي هذا الطريق. هلأ الحرب ما حتنتهي بسرعة وأهدافه اللي بده إياها المقاومة ما حتقبل فيها. بتمنى إنه يزول ينتصر الحق على الباطل ويبطل في شيء اسمه إسرائيل.
بس يلا بس دقيقة.
بدي أسأل أي إذاعة؟
يلا هلا بقول لك. هي اسمها Channel 5.
مش لبنانية ولا برا؟
أجنبية هي. بس احنا طالبين اذن من
لا ما بيأثر بس انا فكرت في اذاعه هون تكتبنا هون هي الام تي في.
لا مش ام تي في.
عم هيدا كتبنا هون تنطمن هون.
مش ام تي في ولا العربيه ولا سكاي نيوز عربيه.
ويلكم ثانك
Thankfully, our guest correspondent talked his way out of that one. But the point is, this young man's rapid transition from grief to vengeance perfectly illustrates why the Israeli bombardment of civilian areas may ultimately backfire on them and exponentially multiply the cycle of revenge that's consumed the Middle East for so long.
There's no bombing your way out of this problem. I mean, there's no way of killing your way out of these situations. And I do think what's going to happen, though, is if the bombing continues, you're still going to get recruitment into these organizations. A lot of 17, 18, 19-year-old people join these organizations because basically they're the meanest sons of bitches on the block. For somebody who has had, difficulties all his life, the idea being is I'm going to join the meanest son of bitches possible. We're going to be part of the meanest gang in the Middle East, and you see that as much of more of a motivation than religious motivation, actually.
ما بتخاف على حالك؟
لا ما بخاف على حالي بالعكس أنا بخاف على اللي بحبهم ما بخاف على حالي.
In addition to targeting civilian areas, Israel has also deliberately targeted American journalists who set out to document the conflict in Lebanon. Here's a story as told by American photojournalist Dylan Collins, who fell victim to an indiscriminate airstrike in the southern border region. Viewer discretion is advised.
To break it down for you, we had arrived at this spot around 5 that day, and there's this big plume of smoke in front of us. We were at a safe distance, 2 kilometers away. I've covered conflict for more than 10 years. This to me seemed like a super safe area, relatively, given the context. We're exposed to multiple Israeli positions along the border. There were drones circling us overhead. An audio analysis of my video showed that an Israeli drone circled us 11 times in the last 25 minutes before we were hit. We were wearing press vests. One of the cars had press written on it. We had 3 live broadcasts going out to 3 international news agencies. They could see us. I felt like we were safe. The fact that we could be seen was a good thing. But apparently it turned us into a target.
It seems almost as if journalists are wearing a target on their back. And there have been cases in which it seems that they've been shot deliberately.
By
IDF.
And IDF doesn't want the news being reported?
Not in that way.
How come?
Well, because the news tends to be tilted against the IDF.
The first strike came out of nowhere. It came from behind us. Big impacts. I saw flames and sparks kind of in my peripheral vision, and I was blown back a little bit. And I just heard Christina screaming, what happened? What happened? Fuck, I can't feel my legs. And my blood went cold. I turned around and I saw her on the ground, and her legs were blown apart at the knees. So I ran towards her, and I had 2 tourniquets with me, and I knew if I didn't get tourniquets on both legs, she's going to bleed out quickly. She was losing a lot of blood. So I got down and started putting a tourniquet onto one of her legs and sliding it up towards the knee to tighten it. But before I could even tighten it, the second strike came, hit the car from Al Jazeera. That exploded. I was injured in that strike. Carmen from Al Jazeera was injured. Elif from Al Jazeera was injured. Blew apart his shoulder. The 2 other Reuters guys were injured as well. We kind of lost the plot. I was super concussed from that second blast, and then my foggy memory, I'm hovering over Christina, who's bleeding and screaming, fuck, what happened? And I look up after the second blast, and I see a leg lying in front of me, which turned out to be the leg of Isam, who was hit by the first blast. And it's just it's hard to put into words the brutality of that kind of strike on a group of clearly marked journalists. There are other ways to get people to turn off their cameras instead of firing 2 tank shells at them directly. They could have sent messages to our phones. They have the capabilities and the technology to do that. They could have fired into the air. They could have dropped leaflets. They've been dropping leaflets, but they fired 2 tank shells at us and then followed it up with nearly 2 minutes of 50 caliber weapon fire. I mean, if that's not a war crime, I'm not really sure what is. Since we were hit, there's been more than 120 journalists that have been killed in very similar circumstances. We've seen journalist families, the homes of journalists being bombed in Gaza. We've seen journalist offices in Gaza being bombed. If the goal is to reduce coverage of the war, then they're clearly succeeding.
I mean, it's a horrific situation. I mean, more journalists have been killed in the Gaza war than any of the other Arab-Israeli wars or any of the other wars between Israel and Hamas or Israel and Hezbollah.
To put it into perspective, in World War II or in Vietnam, there wasn't even a fraction of the amount of journalists killed as have been killed in the past year. It makes you lose faith in the industry that you work in and the power to speak truth to power, to influence opinion. It's been a real hell of a year.
I feel like at this juncture we should back up a bit and explain why things have escalated so fast in Lebanon over the course of the past few months.
One day after the Hamas attack on Israel on October the 7th, Hezbollah officially entered the war.
After the October 7th attacks, in which Hamas killed over 1,200 Israelis, Hezbollah began their attacks the next day and have since fired over 8,000 rockets into Israel. They claimed to be doing this in solidarity with Hamas, but it was likely at the instruction of Iran. Both Hamas and Hezbollah are aligned by what is called the Axis of Resistance, an Iran-backed military coalition, which provides a network of self-proclaimed Islamic resistance groups with weapons and bombs.
I think that for the most part, the Iranians view this as playing defense. The destruction of Israel is something that every once in a while gets talked about, but I think fundamentally the whole idea of supporting Hamas and Hezbollah and other groups as well is the idea that these groups are going to be protecting Iran. Israel is not going to be able to strike against Iran if, for example, they're going to be preoccupied in the north and in the south and in various other places as well. The Iranians don't really have much control over the axis of resistance except to, basically finance them and to build up their strength and to have them serve as sort of a deterrent force against Israel.
After October 7th, eliminating Hamas took priority for Israel for obvious reasons, and so they more or less were ignoring the Hezbollah threat in the north. But once Hamas top leadership had been killed, Netanyahu decided it was go time. Israel began their newest offensive on Hezbollah about 2.5 months ago, on September 17th, 2024, which they kicked off by somehow deploying exploding pagers and flammable walkie-talkies into the hands of Hezbollah militants, a quote-unquote security disaster that killed roughly 50 people, around half of which were civilians.
There might have been something in terms of the Israelis able to interrupt the supply chain for the people manufacturing the pagers and walkie-talkies as well. But again, this is still something that's quite murky.
Since then, it's been non-stop back-and-forth rocket fire between towns along the border. In the past 2 months alone, 3,000 people have been killed in Lebanon. In response, Hezbollah has claimed the lives of 120 Israelis.
It's the deadliest drone attack Hezbollah has carried out against Israel in over a year.
And it's safe to say the death toll in Israel would have been much higher without the Iron Dome defense system.
The Iron Dome system is an anti-missile defense system. And it's not only been effective in terms of these various rockets, but also in terms of drones. And there's another system that they use for ballistic missiles that was used recently when Iran fired ballistic missiles at Israel.
Israel is on the defensive here in their country as missiles are being launched from Iran.
Perhaps the most devastating loss suffered by Hezbollah was the death of their leader, Hassan Nasrallah, who died during an Israeli airstrike on the group's headquarters in Dahiyya. Since then, other Israeli airstrikes have killed many of the group's top commanders and enforcers. However, some are still alive. Here's an interview with a senior official in Hezbollah who would like to remain anonymous due to safety concerns, but felt compelled to give an interview to Channel 5 because he's tired of Hezbollah's message being obscured by what he calls compromised Western media.
عن فلسطين للفلسطينيين للمسيحيين وللمسلمين وحتى لليهود. We are against the Zionist movement, but not against the Jews. We are with the oppressed of the world. When Israel conquered Lebanon, it was necessary for the Shia to establish a party to defend itself. And thus, Hezbollah was founded in the 9th of 1982. And the goal was to defend Lebanon and to expel the conqueror from our land, as the French resistance did and liberated France from the Nazis. We are the same.
Before proceeding, I think it's worth it to give a disclaimer. Here at Channel 5, we do not espouse, advocate for, promote, or condone any groups that use violence to achieve political gain. There are a number of falsehoods and inaccuracies being laid out in the following interview, all of which are diligently fact-checked by Professor Gelvin, who is a scholar with an extensive knowledge of Lebanese history. All right, let's get into it.
Why was Hezbollah founded? When Sykes-Picot divided the Arab countries, Britain brought the Jews to nationalize them in Palestine and achieve their interest. And it founded the Baha'i movement in Iran to strike at the Shia. And they also founded the Ahmadi movement in North Africa and the Wahhabist in Saudi.
Sykes-Picot Agreement was an agreement between the British and the French during World War I to divide up the Middle East. And the thing about it is that it's always blamed for the problems of the Middle East now, that the Europeans divided it up and, between the French and the British, and this is why they drew the borders there and so on and so forth. The Sykes-Picot Agreement was never implemented.
Sykes-Picot was never implemented.
It was never implemented. None of this stuff happened. So what divided up the region? What divided up the region was the mandate system. Palestine and that whole area actually had been under Ottoman control for 400 years. And then with World War I, the Ottomans were defeated and the British and the French took over administrative control of the areas that are now Palestine, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. And the idea was these people aren't ready to govern themselves, so therefore we have to guide them in the path of civilization. And the only two that have remained in effect have been the division between Lebanon and Syria. All the other divisions have fallen away.
And in general, you know how the Jews colonized Palestine and took over. Would you accept that France could be taken over? What did the French resistance do? Do you accept someone stealing your home? We are like that in Lebanon. When Israel took over Palestine, they conquered a part of Lebanon, what is known as the 7 villages.
According to the Hezbollah commander, the definitive starting point of Israeli aggression on the Lebanese people began in 1948, when they forcefully annexed and expelled the residents of 7 Shia Muslim villages along the border of what was then Mandatory Palestine, a British territory, sending the villagers into Lebanon as refugees. These border towns were known as the 7 villages and comprised basically the only community of Shia Muslims in Mandatory Palestine. The greater region that once contained these villages is called the Galilee, which was depopulated by Israel when they declared statehood in 1948.
The campaign in the Galilee in 1948, what the Israelis called the War of Independence and what the Palestinians called the Nakba. In the Galilee, that was a ethnic cleansing took place. And Shiis from these particular villages were expelled into Lebanon by the Israeli forces.
Despite these 7 villages being in British-mandated Palestine back then, the residents, even back then, considered themselves to be Lebanese. That's because in the 1920s, the villages were part of Lebanon. Well, French occupied Lebanon until 1924 when British and French diplomats did a land trade.
There was a certain negotiation that took place and the border was fixed at a different border in 1922 or 23, the Pole-Newcomb line. And this line included the 7 villages in the British zone of Palestine, as opposed to what it had been, which was in the French zone, which got divided up into Lebanon, Syria.
And so the villages became part of mandated Palestine, which was owned by Britain, who would later be sympathetic to Israeli occupation in 1948. So the residents went from Lebanese French subjects to Palestinian British subjects to ethnically Lebanese Palestinian half-citizens raised under British rule, then exiled by Israelis to live a life as refugees in Lebanon, which is the country they wanted to be from in the first place.
Now the whole thing was a mess after the First World War in terms of what the French were attempting to do. The French, for example, took the area that they were mandated, the so-called Syria Mandate, and divided up into 6 subunits at one point.
But here's the point. Hezbollah, in their own mythology, sees themselves as defenders of the now non-existent 7 Shia villages in mandated Palestine, and in their speeches they promise to liberate these areas in North Israel that are now either mounds of dirt or Israeli shopping centers, and return them to their Lebanese sovereignty.
The operational plan to conquer the Galilee was first aired in Nasrallah's announcement on February 16, 2011.
المقاومة التي نعم تملك القدرة للدخول إلى الجليل وهذا ما يعترف به العدو.
And so at this point, what we see is a contestation of who has a right to, these various villages. Hezbollah claims that it's still part of Lebanon. The French had no right, if they did give it away, they had no right to give it away. This is, basically a, shall we say, excuse for continuing their operations in the south.
Do any other sects in Lebanon care much about the villages?
I would tend to doubt that.
But for Hezbollah, and this commander particularly, Israel's depopulation of the villages was the first strike in a subsequent series of psychopathic colonial actions that crescendo into Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982.
They conquered a part of Lebanon, what is known as the 7 villages, and it kept terrorizing and striking Lebanon. The aggression increased and the Lebanese state was weak and couldn't repeal the aggression. Israel attacked and invaded Lebanon until it reached Beirut, and no Arab or foreign country stood with Lebanon, except Syria. And where was the Islamic Revolution led by Imam al-Khomeini in Iran, where before it was an American stronghold? They cut off Americans' hand, and it became a revolution that supported every oppressed human.
Khomeini played his cards very, very well. Basically, there was all sorts of reasons. He was able to create a narrative of the Persian nation, Iranian nation, that was based in Islam, the Shia nation, et cetera, basically was able to pose Iran as an oppressed country in the global structure. And so this was sort of like a winning narrative for Khomeini. Nobody realized the brutality of the Islamic Republic against its own population.
The resistance and Hezbollah started growing. And after the Syrian and Iranian help, they started growing bit by bit until they freed their country. Operations were small but started growing and increasing in numbers until liberation came in the year 2000. The Zionist armies fell back, and so Hezbollah was founded to defend its country.
Israel officially withdrew from southern Lebanon on May 24th, 2000.
Hezbollah takes credit for driving Israel out of Lebanon.
It certainly does. And basically, there's a lot of credit to be taken for that.
For Hezbollah, this was more than a military victory, but a grand defeat of Western imperialism for the entire Islamic world.
When Britain planted Israel, or this temporary entity, in the Middle East, they did so to control its riches. They took over all the Gulf's oil and riches, especially in Lebanon and Syria. To take over these riches, they divided the countries and planted strife. And after the liberation, Britain and America wanted to destroy Lebanon for the sake of Israel. It is true they destroyed a large portion of Lebanon, but Hezbollah were victorious. We defeated Israel, and when we did, they decided to strike Iran and Syria. This was admitted by Ehud Olmert and Hillary Clinton. We must also mention that America founded Al-Qaeda and Bin Laden in Afghanistan to put pressure on the Soviet Union.
We armed the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, and they turned on us and created Al-Qaeda.
That's true?
That is true, yeah. But this isn't true.
They founded Al-Qaeda, and it spread as a Muslim outfit, and it started committing heinous terrorist attacks attributed to Muslims. But Muslims are the opposite of that. Islam preaches compassion and acknowledges Christianity and Judaism, and humanity too. We see humans as humans. We don't care if they are Christians, Jews, Buddhists, or anything else.
The commander also believes that ISIS was an American proxy, set up to destabilize Syria and eliminate Hezbollah.
When Israel was pushed back in 2006, America and Britain decided to destroy Syria, so they founded ISIS. All their leaders are American intelligence. They founded ISIS under the guise of Islam, and they started attacking everywhere with Nusra Front and others. And all of them are terrorist movements founded by Americans and Israelis. America planted ISIS and fought them. They made ISIS their excuse to keep their American bases in Arab countries, saying they're fighting the terrorism that they created. When ISIS took over Syria, we saw that their goal was to destroy Hezbollah and the Syrian state. We saw all this terrorism and realized that when ISIS was done with Syria, they were coming to Lebanon, and we went into Syria and fought ISIS.
With this operation, Hezbollah wanted to be seen as fighting terrorism, not part of it.
So why was Hezbollah so proactive in fighting ISIS?
Because the two groups hate each other. They were on opposite sides in the Syrian civil war. Fundamentally, ISIS is out for ends that are very, very different than Hezbollah's ends. ISIS was making war on Shi'is also. The goal of ISIS was to remake the map of the Middle East and maybe further by getting rid of the borders that were there in between, in particular, Syria and Iraq. The idea was there for them to restore a caliphate in Syria and Iraq, and then expand the borders from there. And their caliphate was pretty much the equivalent of a Sunni state. As a matter of fact, you could say ISIS represented a Sunni form of nationalism in the same way that Hezbollah represents a Shi'i form of not nationalism, but sectarianism.
As time passed, martyrs paid the price, and we got rid of ISIS from most of the Syrian territory, and we protected Lebanon from them. Here we returned to occupied Palestine. The entire world knows that Palestine was taken by the Zionist group with British and then later American support. Israel did killing, slaughter, and genocide. Even in 2006, they struck a UN headquarters and 300 women and children died while under the protection of the UN. Israel doesn't accept any international law. They consider themselves on top of the world, and the rest of the world are their servants. Israel said, why is Hezbollah helping the people of Gaza? And why did they open support front? Because the American-British plan is to first destroy Gaza, the West Bank, and then Lebanon. We already explained why we're fighting. We are fighting to defend our country. Israel occupied Lebanon and we freed our land. And now we support and help the Palestinians because we believe that when Israel is done with Gaza, we are next. And this is the reason for the preemptive defensive of our country and people. The rest of the world should find truthful news and not the Zionist media. The main and final condition to stop the war in the south of Lebanon is to stop the war in Gaza. When the war in Gaza stops, Hezbollah won't fight anymore.
Despite the innumerable losses taken by Hamas leadership, the commander remains confident that Israel will lose the war in the end.
Because the internal situation in Israel is divided and shattered. I think America is trying to find a way out for Netanyahu, but I think he will meet his fate like others before him.
Despite the commander's confidence about Israel's destruction, in the far north of Israel, residents are somewhat uneasy given the circumstance.
יש פיצוצים כל הזמן, כאילו כל איזה 3 דקות יש פיצוצים, הפגזות.
But as captured by our correspondent, Agat Schwartz, the vibe in the border town of Kiryat Shimona is not one of fear and panic. Most of the people there are determined to stay put.
בית שלי. ואני כבר חי פה 42 שנה, וזה הבית שלי, אף פעם לא עזבתי. פה אנחנו נחיה ופה אנחנו גם נקבר בבוא היום.
ושום מקום בארץ בעצם לא בטוח. איך אומרים, אני לא פוחדת מאף אחד.
This demeanor was actually familiar to me. Though a vastly different situation, my one and only time in an active war zone was in western Ukraine, 30 days after the war began in 2021. Despite constant air raid sirens, locals shooting cutouts of Vladimir Putin with a BB gun, and the occasional offhand comment about an impending Russian offensive, I noticed that for the most part, the people of Lviv were trying their best to maintain their daily routines and hold on to any semblance of structure amid an uncertain future. And the same was true in northern Israel, which actually makes a lot of sense. Despite the perception often enforced by American leftists who believe that all Israelis are more or less European origin colonizer types who moved there after 1948, Israel's northern district is more than 50% Arab and contains almost as many Muslims as it does Jews. And many of those Jewish people who live in the north are indigenous to Arab lands in North Africa and the Middle East, where they lived in countries like Iraq and Tunisia before being expelled on the basis of religion.
The Ashkenazis are not the majority of the Israeli population. You have Mizrahis who are Arab Jews who came over after 1948 from places like Yemen and Syria and Egypt and North Africa and so on and so forth.
This might come as a shock to people who believe that everyone in Israel looks like Jonah Hill or Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But the area being bombed by Hezbollah almost every day is a mixture of Muslim, Circassian, Druze, Syrian, Jewish, Christian, Bedouin, Baha'i, and Armenian people, all of whom are Israeli citizens, living normal lives with no vested interest in conquering Lebanon. Here's a glimpse into life in one of the border villages.
All right, so we just arrived to Rechania. It's a small village in the upper side of the north, a Cherkessic and Arabic village that has been suffering from a lot of bombardments since the beginning of the conflict. We are going to start with a local that agreed to host us. I hope to find a bit more about how she's coping with this and what's the situation over here.
אני גרה ברחניה, אנחנו כבר שנה במלחמה פה. אני למדתי משפטים במרכז, וכרגע אני לא יכולה להמשיך את ההתמחות שלי בגלל המצב. יש לי בן קטן בן 1.5 שנה, ואין גנים, אז אני צריכה לשמור עליו. זה פעם ראשונה שאני חווה את האימהות, וזה ממש קשה. במקום ליהנות מהמצב שאני אימא עכשיו, אני לא יכולה לצאת איתו לשום מקום, כי הכל סגור. ואני משחקת איתו בחוץ ליד הבית, ומנסה כמה שיותר שיהיה בחוץ ושישחק כמו ילד רגיל, אבל זה ממש מפחיד. הוא בן 1.5 שנה, אבל הוא מבין את המצב. כל פעם שהוא שומע בומים, הוא אומר בום, בום.
כאילו, החיים בצפון הם די שוממים, די משותקים כבר שנה. וזה רק הלך והחריף בתקופה האחרונה. יש לנו פה כל היום טילים מעל הראש, אזעקות, כל היום בממ"דים, מי שיש לו משפחות עם ילדים, אז החיים פה הם די עצובים אפשר להגיד. הוא באמת אחד היישובים הכי יפים וייחודיים באזור. זה כפר שהוא צ'רקסי וערבי, כאילו מעורב. הצ'רקסים עלו מקפקז לפה, נדמה לי ב-1824, משהו כזה. יש לך שתי כפרים צ'רקסים, ריחניה וכפר קמא. יש משהו כמו 4,000, 5,000 צ'רקסים, חלק פה, חלק בכפר קמא, משהו כמו 40 דקות. באמת, זה מורשת שהיא מיוחדת.
אתה צ'רקסי בעצם?
אני לא, אני ערבי מוסלמי. אבל יש לי שכנים צ'רקסים, אני גדלתי איתם, למדנו באותו בית ספר, ואני מכיר כאילו את המורשת, אני גם דובר את השפה הצ'רקסית. אני מכיר אותם כאילו מקרוב, יש לי חברים צ'רקסים, כאילו יש להם ריקוד מיוחד, אוכל מיוחד, סגנון חיים אחר, מה שאנחנו רגילים אליו. וזה כיף תמיד ללמוד תרבויות אחרות, חוץ מהתרבויות שיש לנו פה בישראל.
עכשיו טועים בי הדרוזים, טועים בי הציונים, כל העדות טועים בי.
בעצם מוסלמי או דרוזי?
מוסלמי.
מה, אתה בעצם מאמין באלוהים?
שמה, אתה מאמין באלוהים? אני הייתי בסעודיה בחאג'. תודה לאל, אני מאמין בכל דת ודת. מאמין בכל הקהל שאלוהים ברא אותו באדמה. מה ההבדל בין יהודי לערבי, לדרוזי, לצ'רקסי, לנוצרי, לכולם? לא כל אלוהים כולם ברא אותם? אז למה להבדיל בין זה וזה?
יפה מאוד.
זה כיף כאילו לחיות במקום שיש לך מלא תרבויות שונות, וכאילו ישראל יש לך מכל התרבויות שיש בעולם, אני מאמין, יש לך הכל מהכל, וזה כיף.
נולדת כאן?
כן, אני נולדתי כאן, וגם ההורים שלי נולדו כאן. אני אוהב את השקט הזה, את השלווה, את הרוגע, מקום מיוחד, מקום שהוא עתיק, הוא קיים כבר משהו קרוב ל100 וקצת שנים, אבל זה לא כבר שקט, זה כבר שקט ופחד. אני יודע שבכל רגע יכול ליפול עליי טיל באמצע שום מקום, טילים, אם זה 7 לאוקטובר שני, פה אצלנו באזור.
אתה חושב בעצם שהם תכננו לעשות משהו כזה?
אני די בטוח, כי כבר אמרו את זה גם אני ראיתי לפני לא הרבה זמן את המפות ואת כל ההתארגנויות ואת כל הפירים, את כל המנהרות שחיזבאללה תכנן במשך מלא זמן, עשרות שנים.
אנחנו מכירים את הפיגוע הקשה מאוד של חוליה שנכנסה לבית ספר במעלות ורצחה תלמידים. אנחנו מכירים את הפיגוע הקשה, ממש פה קיבוץ שנמצא ממש פה על הקצה של הרכס של ההר, משגבם, שנכנסו לבית הילדים בשנת 81 ורצחו. עכשיו, כשחיזבאללה כתב את החזון שלו, כי בעצם הוא שם לעצמו מטרות. והמטרה הראשונה הייתה שהוא ישיג את צה"ל מלבנון, ולהחזיר את הריבונות הלבנונית על כל הצד שראינו של הכפרים שאנחנו שלטנו בהם. המטרה השנייה, הוא הגדיר לעצמו כל מיני סכסוכי גבול שהם פה, ממש כפרים שקרובים לגבול, והגדיר 7 כפרים שלשיטתו זה היו אדמות לבנוניות לפני מלחמת העצמאות. השלב השלישי זה היה להגיע עד ירושלים, בעצם לחסל את הישות הציונית.
ושיהיה שלום כבר, כי חלאס נמאס.
כולם רוצים לחיות בטוב, כולם רוצים חיים טובים, ככה אני מאמינה.
איך אתה רואה את העתיד שלך? מה היית רוצה שיקרה?
שיקרה שלום, בלי מלחמה.
איך אתה חושב שהעם הלבנוני רואה את זה?
חלק לדעתי רואים את זה כטוב, חלק כלא. אני רוצה להאמין שהרוב רואים את זה שנצח את חיזבאללה והם יוכלו לחזור לחיים שלהם, למה כרגע הכלכלה שלהם על הפנים, החיים שלהם על הפנים.
One trope often repeated by Israelis in the north is that the Lebanese people don't actually support Hezbollah and are more or less being held captive by an authoritarian militia who will kill them if they speak out. According to Gelvin, this isn't exactly true. However, Hezbollah still isn't as popular as they claim to be.
I'm asked frequently, how popular is Hezbollah in Lebanon? And Hezbollah is popular within the Shi'i community, but within other communities, it's not particularly popular at all.
Here's an interview with a Christian man on the streets of Beirut who doesn't feel that Hezbollah represents Lebanon whatsoever and blames the Shia Muslim community entirely for this situation.
Well, obviously, it's the Shia Muslims to blame because they initiated the fucking war. And when they got slapped and capped by the Israelis and the American intelligence, now they're asking for let's stop the war and let's stop this shit. No, man. You started the fucking war, man, up to it, fight your war, fight your thing. They're just like fucking proxies taking orders from Iran. They're not even an Arab country like Iran. To be honest, this thing is really like irritating us as Lebanese because we're forced to leave our countries now just because of their silly fucking wars. If you check their numbers, they killed more Arabs than Israelis. That's a fact. We're just waiting to get our papers, get our passports, leave this country, and let them burn in hell, all of them. Right? We have an economic crisis, we have everything, and still you created a fucking war for us.
It's obvious that vast subsections of Lebanese society do not support Hezbollah. To get an alternative history of the Israel-Hezbollah beef, Agat tracked down a recently retired IDF official who once oversaw the border region for several decades to see what he had to say about the past, present, and future of this lengthy conflict.
שלום לכולם, שמי רונן כהן. הייתי בצבא מרבית השנים באגף המודיעין, ושילבתי בין תפקידים שהם תפקידי שדה בשטח, בכל מיני גזרות, כמו הגזרה הזאת שאתם רואים פה לבנון. התגייסתי בערך כשנה לאחר מלחמת שלום הגליל, וסיימתי כקצין המודיעין של פיקוד מרכז, שאחראי על כל מה שקורה ביהודה ושומרון, מפקדת הפיקוד בירושלים. זה ארגון הטרור הכי חזק בעולם. חיזבאללה בכל העולם כולו, זה ארגון הטרור הכי חזק. הוא ממש נקרא צבא.
Hezbollah became the most powerful non-state army in the world.
לא מעניין אותם להיות לבנונים, מעניין אותם שלבנון תהפוך להיות כמו איראן. כלומר, מדינה שיעית, איסלאמית, קיצונית, עם משטר דתי קיצוני, והם ישלטו. וכל שאר העדות, והם רבים, יסורו למרותם.
So what percent of Lebanon is Shia? Is it a small fraction or is it a majority?
Certainly not a majority. The Shia community in Lebanon is concentrated in two areas. It's concentrated in the south on the one hand, and it's concentrated in the far east, in the Bekaa Valley.
וחיזבאללה, בגלל שיש לה את הגב של איראן עם התקציב העצום והתמיכה, היא הצליחה פה להשתלט על האזור השיעי. לבנון היא ארץ מאוד מיוחדת, כי בעצם היא שילוב של עדות שאם מסתכלים, אין קשר ביניהם. מוסלמים, שהם גם סונים וגם שיעים. יש שם נוצרים ומרונים, שהם ערבים נוצרים. יש שם דרוזים. ויש גם המון פלסטינאים, שהגיעו גם כתוצאה מהתקופה של מלחמת העצמאות שלנו, 48, שברחו הרבה. אם הייתם לבנונים, היה אכפת לכם מלבנון. לא הייתם כל היום מחרחרים מלחמה. וחיזבאללה הוא למעשה גם הזרוע הקדומנית של איראן. והוא זה שיעשה את כל המלחמות נגדנו, עד שהם ישיגו את המטרת העל שלהם, שהיא הגרעין.
The report states that since July, Iran has continued to increase its stockpiles of 20% and 60% enriched uranium.
חיזבאללה היה צריך לשמור על הדבר הזה, וכל פעם שיש איזה סכסוך, שכל האש תופנה פה ללבנון. פחות אכפת לאיראנים, אלה שמסביב.
Shortly after this interview, a formal ceasefire was apparently declared between Hezbollah and Israel, backed by President Biden.
It is an important night in the Middle East. In the last hour, we've had an announcement from President Biden endorsing a ceasefire agreement.
President Joe Biden announces a ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, calling it and saying it was designed to be a permanent cessation of hostilities, also expressing hope it will lead to an end to the fighting in Gaza.
The fighting across the Lebanese-Israeli border will end.
But Ronen remains confident that Hezbollah will violate the ceasefire.
כולם מדברים על הסכם. בוא נסיים את המלחמה הזאת ונעשה הסכם. ואני שואל, ההסכם הזה, למה הוא שווה? הוא לא שווה את הנייר שהוא חתום עליו. כי הארגון טרור לא מתכוון לקיים אותו.
So he believes the only logical next step is a full-blown military occupation of the south of Lebanon.
עכשיו, לכל מי שמסתכל מכם, זה נראה הדבר הכי פסטורלי בעולם. ככה תמיד לבנון הייתה. העמק הזה היפה עם כל השדות והקרמים, זה עמק קדש. הכל שקט, הכל ירוק, הכל יפה. יש פה תקופות בשנה שזה ממש מדהים, הטבע והפריחה, אבל למעשה מאחורי התמימות יש פה בתים שלא סתם קראתי לזה כפרים של חיזבאללה. הם אמנם כפרים עם אוכלוסייה שיעית, אבל חיזבאללה התמקם בתוכם, ובשנים האחרונות נערך לפלישה על מנת לכבוש את כל האזור שאתם רואים, שאנחנו נמצאים פה היום. צה"ל נשאר שם. איפה שהוא נכנס היום, לא חשוב אם זה קילומטר, 2, 3, הוא נשאר שם, והוא גם מוודא שאף אחד לא חוזר לשם, כולל אותם תושבים. עכשיו, תבוא המדינה הלבנונית ותגיד, רגע, זה שטח ריבוני שלי, ואנחנו צריכים להגיד לא. זה לכאורה היה שטח ריבוני שלכם, אבל חיזבאללה הפקיע אותו, אנחנו לא נאפשר.
Whether or not this military occupation will actually happen is yet to be determined. But politics aside, life for civilians in Lebanon who have been affected by this conflict will never be the same. Of the millions of people displaced, some are returning to their homes after the ceasefire, but some families have no homes to return to and are living on the street in tents with no option but survival.
هاي الخيمة اللي شايلتنا وشايلة الأولاد وشايلة العيلة.
هون أنت عايش؟
أنا هون عايش، ولو ما الله وهالخيمة أولادي جمدوا من البرد، وبالشتاء ما أعرف حالي وين بدي أروح الصراحة. ملنا نكوخ للأولاد عشان يعني بكرة إذا شتت الدنيا وين بدنا نروح؟ بدي يلطيلي تحت بناي، تحت شي محل هيك بس عشان أولادي. أنا ما عندي مشكلة تشتي علي، حجران تشتي علي ما عندي مشكلة، بس المهم الأطفال الصغار بس. أنا هدول بيهموني، هدول حياتي كلها. أنا ما فرقانة عندي موت عيش آخر همي، المهم أولادي يكونوا بخير. أي والله تعال شو حابب أبيع حالي كرمال أولادي، والله العظيم مين ما كان بيع حالي يا أخي، بيع كلوتي كرمال أولادي، بيع عيوني كرمال أولادي، كرمال يعيشوا وياكلوا ويشربوا ويكونوا مسعودين. أولادي 3 ومرتي حبلة إلها 18، بس عشان مرتي إلها 18 حبلة وما قادر أخلفها، يعني أنا ما معي أدفع للمستشفى إذا بدها مصاري، وإذا بيخلفوا لي إياها ببلاش بكون ممنونة. يا ريت.
عرفتوا طيب إذا صبي أو بنت ولا
والله ما معنا نعمل صورة، تاركينا على الله، بس الله هو اللي بيعلم. المهم الخلقة الكاملة صبي وبنت ما عندنا مشكلة.
كيفك؟
قل له كيفك عمو؟ كيفك؟
ماشي الحال؟
ولادي ولاد تياب، الأغراض أغراض بيتي كلها راح. أنا كان عندي أغراض منيح، كان عندي صالون أوضة نوم كله راح.
وبيناتك شو صار؟
كلها نزلت، كلها دمار صارت، يعني حجر على حجر ما ضل. يعني كيف بدي اقول لك، عم بيت امي عم فجأة لما ضربوا المريجة عم طلعنا على البرندة، انا عم بطلع هيك معنا الدجة، عم طلعنا لقينا البناية كلها نازلة، حد البناية اللي انا فيها، البناية اللي فيها اللي حدها كمان رايح. يعني لقينا طلعنا امنا هربنا، شو اي بيوت صارت على الارض دمار، ما في ولا شرطوطة على شرطوطة ضل. بيت صفي الدين نحن حد بيتنا، يعني لقينا طلعنا امنا هربنا، شو اي بيوت صارت على الارض دمار.
Israel has killed Hezbollah's new leader in a blitz on a hidden bunker in Lebanon. Hashem Safadine was a powerful cleric within Hezbollah's ranks, who is next in line to replace Hassan Nasrallah.
In a statement, the army said he died along with Hezbollah's intelligence commander in an airstrike on the southern suburbs of Beirut, near the airport, on October 4th, a week after Nasrallah was killed in similar circumstances.
الحمد لله ممنا فدنا بأولادنا وبعيالنا، هاي أهم شيء. لا بيت مثل الخلق، ولا نومة مثل الخلق، ولا أكلة مثل الخلق، ولا شربة مثل.
Unfortunately, there is very little humanitarian aid being distributed to these internally displaced refugees, but there are still many options to provide direct aid if you want to support and donate funds to help them.
You've mentioned a campaign that you guys launched after the strike.
Yes, we continued what we were doing with Julia.
Before this man's sister passed away from an Israeli airstrike, she was already running an aid and donations program for displaced people who'd lost their homes. So he decided to keep it running in her honor.
By her name, it's called Julia's Fist. So everything we do for good will be going out of her hand. With the budget we have now, we are doing food for displaced people, and we are working with our communications and connections to have more donations so we can bring blankets, food, clothes, anything to help these people. You know, we are going on winter now. The weather will be a little bit cold. They need something to make them feel warm. So we're doing to bring blankets and clothes. And we are accepting any donations on, you can find it on the page.
If you'd like to donate to this campaign, please go to their GoFundMe, which I've left a link up for in the description and the pinned comment of this video. As you can see, they have a $30,000 goal, but have only been able to raise above $900. I'm gonna give $1,000 right now, and I hope that we can come together and help them reach that goal.
Yeah, good luck with what you're doing. And again, like I will say it 100 times, I'm sorry for your loss. What can I say?
Nothing can be said.
Exactly.
Channel 5 live worldwide, Hollywood and Vine.
Fuck the authority, Channel 5 News.
Channel 55, we don't fuck with custers. And 5 is the best number.
Professor Gelvin also doesn't believe the ceasefire will be effective in achieving peace in the region, not because of Hezbollah militancy or American indifference, but the military-industrial complex itself.
The United States gives Israel a large amount of money every year, billions of dollars every year for weaponry. And it gives Egypt a large amount of money every year, $1.6 billion for weaponry as well. And the thing about the weaponry is we don't give them the weapons. You know, we don't give them anything except a shopping list. And they come to the United States and they say, we want the following things. We want this number of Humvees, we want this number of rockets, we want this number of stuff. And the Americans then, you know, basically contract with Lockheed Martin and various other factories, and they keep their lines open. Now, these corporations, you know, put their factories in a lot of swing congressional districts, and so they can't be shut down without the congressperson losing, you know, the next election. So these are jobs programs. These aren't armaments programs. When Eisenhower said, beware the military-industrial complex, this is exactly what he was talking about. He was talking about the idea that, you know, basically the United States is the major arms supplier in the world as part of the American, as part of a welfare system to keep people employed in manufacturing.
Gelvin also doesn't believe that Israel will really ever be able to eliminate Hezbollah, despite the fact that they've pushed them back from the border after the ceasefire.
I mean, ultimately, the Israelis are not going to win this one. Hezbollah very likely will be chased up a bit from the south. That UNIFIL will take its role again. The United Nations international force in Lebanon will take its observer status again, separating the two sides. And I think that, you know, Hezbollah will lick its wounds and survive.
Do you think there would be peace in the Middle East if they were left alone by the West in general?
No, I don't think so. I think the number of casualties would be probably far less. But I think there's enough, for example, there's enough people who are willing to sell the Middle East weapons besides the United States as well.